Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm here to review another two books from the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction long list. So the two books from the Walter Scott Prize long list I'm going to be reviewing today actually both made the shortlist, so I will talk a bit about the shortlist towards the end of this video because the shortlist has now been announced. I have now read 3 out of 5 of the shortlist, so I will be reading more from the shortlist later this month, but there are also quite a lot of books from the long list that I am still hoping to get to, so there will be reviews coming for books from the long list and the shortlist in the next few weeks. I'm hoping to get through quite a few Walter Scott Prize books in May. But I read 2 Walter Scott Prize books in April that I want to tell you about today, one of which is The Matchbox Girl by Alice Jolly, and the other one is Ben Becka by Graham McRae Burnett. And I think I will start off by talking about Ben Becka because I feel like I have a lot less to say about it. Ben Becka is a very short novel. I listened to it on audiobook, and the audiobook is, I think, 5 hours, and a good, I think about an hour of that is the afterward. So it's only sort of 4 hours long. It's a very, very short book. And it's a short, intense, sort of literary crime, maybe, would be the right genre definition for it. Obviously it is historical too. It's set in the 1850s. It's very literary in some ways, in that it's very much sort of premise driven, not plot driven, which is often, I find, a helpful distinction for me between sort of more literary and more commercial novels, especially as someone who generally prefers more plot driven to premise driven books. So what I mean is, Ben Becka has like a quite sort of interesting dramatic premise, but it's really all about that premise. There isn't sort of much more plot than the premise. And there is a sort of crime element at the heart of the novel, but it isn't a sort of conventional mystery or crime story. So Ben Becka is told from the perspective of a man who is living alone in his family home on the Scottish island of Ben Becka in the mid-19th century. He was one of 4 siblings, but he's now the only one left because 5 or 6 years before the sort of current present day of the narrative, his younger brother murdered their parents and their aunt. And the book is basically the narrator, Malcolm, looking back on the events of that day, looking back on his brother Angus's actions, whether they as a family could have seen what he did coming. And the book also looks at sort of what has happened since and what his life is like in the present. As I said, it is a very short, kind of intense novel, and that premise is sort of most of what the book is. The book is a lot of Malcolm kind of reflecting on what happened and comparing himself to his brother Angus, really. Sort of the question at the heart of the novel, I guess, in many ways for Malcolm is, what if I am not a better person than my brother who did this terrible thing? And all of this, I should say, is based on real historical events. So this is based on a real murder that took place in the 1850s, and in the afterward the author talks quite a lot about kind of what is and isn't known, and yeah, the real events of this case. I have mixed feelings about Ben Becka as a novel. I think a bit like Sea Scraper, one of the other books from the Walter Scott Prize long list that I've read, which also made the shortlist and is also a short, more literary novel. I feel like I want a bit more plot from a novel, and both Sea Scraper and Ben Becka are sort of more premise-led than plot-led, by which I mean there's sort of a premise and that premise is explored rather than there being sort of new plot elements and discoveries along the way. So I did find it an interesting book, and I would say that overall I preferred Ben Becka to Sea Scraper, but both of them I think are not quite my cup of tea and are a bit more on the sort of literary side. Not necessarily in terms of experimental writing or anything like that, but in terms of having a premise and exploring that premise rather than having a sort of narrative plot. I also struggled a bit with Ben Becka because it's in first person, and it's quite an intense novel, as I said, and it's all told from the perspective of Malcolm. And Malcolm is just not a very nice person, and I hated being in his head. He's very judgmental, he's very sexist, he looks down on sort of everyone around him. I hated being in his head, and I think you're meant to. Like, as I said, one of the sort of questions of the novel, and one of the questions from Malcolm himself, is what if I'm not a better person than my brother who did these horrendous things? So I think it's, you know, intentional that Malcolm is not a likeable character and that you're not meant to enjoy being in his head. But that did mean that there were quite a few times when I was reading it, listening to it, just sort of not wanting to listen to it because I found his head such an unpleasant place to be. For example, there's a neighbour who comes to help him around the house, and the way he thinks about her especially I found very, very hard to read. And like I said, I think that's the point, and I think it is done well, but that does mean it wouldn't like be a favourite for me because it was such a sort of unpleasant reading experience. So I found it an interesting novel in many ways, but I also feel like it wasn't 100% my thing. I was also thinking about it sort of as a work of historical fiction, looking at, you know, the Walter Scott Prize being a prize for historical fiction. I'm always really interested to look at how the books they select look at history. And I think there's a few interesting things here. Obviously, Ben Becka is a novel about a real historical event and about real historical circumstances. And so that is all quite interesting and quite historically interesting. But also, it's a novel that feels quite timeless in some ways. I think especially because it's about this very small rural island community where life isn't really changing much decade by decade. I know that it's set in the 1850s, but it feels like it could be set sort of anywhere between the 17th and very early 20th century. There isn't much in it that feels very tied to a time, except that obviously it is about a real historical event. So I found that an interesting thing to think about. I don't know if the fact that it doesn't feel very historically grounded makes it more or less interesting as a historical novel, because in a way that is really interesting, that it's about this community where things aren't changing. That is sort of important to the themes of the book. So in that sense, I quite liked the sort of fact that it didn't feel very historically grounded, but also as someone who loves reading books about the 19th century, I felt like it wasn't enough about the 19th century for me. But I think that's very much a personal thing. Certainly if I compare it to a book like Clear by Karis Davis, which was on the Walter Scott Prize long list last year, which I sort of automatically started comparing to Ben Becka because they're both short novels set on small Scottish islands, but they are very, very different books. I loved Clear. Clear was much more sort of grounded to and exploring the 19th century, whereas I feel like Ben Becka is doing that less. And I don't think it's trying to do that, but maybe I like books that do that more. But I also think, as I said, that's very much personal taste. So I enjoyed Ben Becka. As I said, I think I'd probably rate it more highly than Sea Scraper, which I reviewed a few weeks ago, and I'll leave that video linked down below. But it wasn't a favourite for me. It wasn't really the kind of thing I love to read. However, one thing I do love about reading along with the Walter Scott Prize long list every year, as I've been doing for many years now, is that it often pushes me to read books that are slightly outside my comfort zone, that aren't something I would otherwise pick up. And sometimes I have great success and sometimes I have less success, but it's always interesting to read different kinds of things and different kinds of historical fiction. And now let's talk about The Matchbox Girl by Alice Jolly, which I loved. I loved so much. So much. Like, yeah. I thought this was absolutely incredible. I have many things to say about it. This was my first sort of 5-star from the Walter Scott Prize long list this year. And I think especially because last year, the Walter Scott Prize long list just like really aligned with my taste, and I had like so many new favourites from it. So I was a bit sad that I hadn't like had a 5-star from the Walter Scott Prize long list yet. And then I read this and it was just incredible. But yeah, I have many more books to read from the long list. I hope I will find some more 5 stars. But yes, The Matchbox Girl is amazing. I have tabbed it, as you can see, and I very, very, very rarely tabbed fiction, which I think tells you how much I love this book and how much it spoke to me. I have tabbed 2 fiction books in the past, like, 10 years. This and Orbital by Samantha Harvey. There are many books I love that I don't want to tab, but I think when I do end up tabbing a book, that is a particular form of praise from me. Anyway, let me tell you what this book is about. The Matchbox Girl is set in Austria in the 1930s and 40s, and we're following a girl called Adelheid. We first meet her when she is, I guess, sort of 11 or 12 years old, and we follow her for the course of a decade, so we follow her until she's in her 20s. And this book looks at her life in Vienna in the run-up to the Second World War and during the Nazi annexation of Austria. So the novel begins with Adelheid's grandmother taking Adelheid to the Children's Hospital in Vienna and asking for help with Adelheid and help with her behaviour, because she no longer feels that she is able to look after Adelheid. Adelheid is, as I said, 11 or 12 years old. She doesn't speak, but she does write. She writes a lot of things down in her notebook. She also collects matchboxes, or specifically like the the lids of matchboxes, if that makes sense. She collects them in these very orderly notebooks. She's trying to work up to a collection of 1,000. As I said, she likes to write things down in her notebooks. And when Adelaide's grandmother takes her to the hospital, she explains that Adelaide's grandfather has recently died, that Adelaide refuses to believe this and keeps writing down in her notebooks that her grandfather is still alive. The book begins with Adelaide kind of being assessed in the hospital and being kept in the hospital for some time on what is called the Curative Education Ward. And this ward is run by a man who is referred to in the book as Dr. A, but you know as a reader and from the blurb, etc., that this is Dr. Asperger, who is obviously a key early figure in research around autism. And as a modern reader, you know, you can recognise Adelaide and various of the other children that she meets as autistic. And the book is about Adelaide's life over a decade, her connection to this ward, the people she meets there, both other children and also the medical staff, the friends that she makes, and the greater understanding of herself and the world around her that she gains as she grows up. But it's also, obviously, as I said, set in 1930s and 40s Vienna. And through Adelaide's eyes, you are watching the rise of fascism and Nazi annexation and the increasing pressure on everyone to join the Nazi party. Several of the medical staff who work at the hospital are Jewish and are forced to flee the country. And the children within this hospital and within the Curative Education Ward, they are obviously also in grave danger from the Nazi regime. And you are following all of these sort of huge social, political upheavals from Adelaide's perspective, and as she grows up and starts to sort of understand the world around her more, she starts to understand what is happening to her country and to the world. And it's just, I just thought this was absolutely incredible. It is such a complicated, rich, fantastic novel that is very pacey, very, very readable, really, really engaging. I read this in, I think, 2 days, and I just found it sort of hugely compelling. And I was so emotionally invested. I just loved Adelaide as a narrator, as a character. I was so invested in her and her story and her relationships with the people around her. It is a book which deals with a lot of like really upsetting things, obviously, because of the subject matter and the time it's writing about. But it's also a book that is hopeful in so many ways, that looks at found family and small acts of resistance and people trying to protect each other. And I loved the connections that Adelaide forms with so many of the people who work in this hospital. I think the complexity with which this book is written and the way it engages with history and sort of what we do and don't know about the past was just done so well. As I said, it's in first-person perspective, from Adelaide's perspective, but there are these sort of interlude chapters where Adelaide tells you what's happening to other people. So we also follow two of the medical staff from the hospital who are Jewish and forced to flee. We follow their lives in America as well, and I found their story like really powerful. Some of the medical staff in the book are real historical figures, obviously Dr. Asperger, but also George Frankl, who's quite an important character in this book. He was also a real person, and his research on autism was also really instrumental and has sort of been forgotten about for many years. I was reading some other things about him online, which were really interesting, and I really liked his role in this novel. As I said, I just found this a really, really powerful, clever, important book, asking lots of important questions, engaging really well with its subject matter and its characters, and just really moving and compelling. And I love the way it's told. So it is told, as I said, in first person, and the narrative voice is very distinct. So capitalization is used mid-sentence for emphasis, and sometimes a few words are like shoved together to make one word for emphasis or dramatic effect. There are also no speech marks, and I thought all of this really, really worked. I love the narrative style. When I was reading reviews for this on Goodreads and Storygraph, I feel like quite a few people didn't get on with the narrative style. I thought it really, really, really worked. So I would highly recommend, if you start this novel and you're a few pages in and you're not quite sure about the narrative style, do persevere, because once you get into the narrative style, it works so well. I don't always have a lot of time for experimentation for the sake of experimentation. You know, I generally prefer my books to have speech marks, unless there's a good reason for them not to have speech marks. But I thought all of the unusual writing decisions made in this book were made for clear reasons and work really, really well. I loved the way this story was told. I thought it all had a reason and made Adelaide's narrative voice so much clearer, and was really impactful and really, really worked. Just to come back to that sort of question of how books on the Walter Scott Prize longlist engage with history, because as I said, that's something I'm always really interested in. And I think The Matchbox Girl is a really, really interesting novel about history, in that it is looking at, you know, some real historical people, some fictional people, looking at real historical events that we know some things about but don't know everything about, and looking at how we look back on the past. I kind of don't want to say too much about that because that is sort of what the book is as a whole, and what the book is doing, and you need to read the book. But I thought the way that was done was really, really interesting, and the way the book engages with history and sort of storytelling and what people do and don't know about what's going on in their own time, and what they see and don't see, like all of that stuff I thought was fantastic, and is something that I really value in a novel just to read as a novel, but especially in a historical novel on a prize about historical fiction. I wanted to read a little bit from the book. It's from quite late on, but it's not spoilery, because I just thought this was a really sort of interesting discussion of history. The proper ordering of the world. Is it possible? In this connection, Sister Joanna does talk of her love of history. However, she is also worried because history is about judgment, and when accounts of our own troubled times are written, how might we be judged? Is Grille Paza not right to say we walk behind our own corpse in our own lifetime? Sister Victorine is not troubled by such questions, as she has always preferred stories, saying history is surely only the skimmed milk of the past. Everything we might really want to know is absent. Historians only tell you how things should have been done. Any fool can tell you that after the event. I'm going to read you one other little bit from the beginning, actually, which I think is quite telling of Adelaide, and her sort of struggles with the world around her. Also, Oma may tell me again and again that I must do what is appropriate. I hate that word. It is a club for which they never tell you the rules, and therefore you cannot join. And that idea of sort of appropriate versus inappropriate, and what you are meant to do, is a really important theme throughout, especially as the social rules around Adelaide changes. People begin to tell her what to do, and she's given all of these rules, but some of the rules she knows are not right. And I just thought all of that was done so well. There were so many moments that I just found sort of so emotional and so powerful. And some of it, as I said, is very stark and upsetting, because of the subject matter. You know, even leaving aside the sort of weight of history, and the danger you know everyone is in, there are people in Adelaide's life and people who she meets who have no understanding for her and no wish to understand her, and that is very hard to read. But also this book is full of people who do understand her and who do try to understand her, and who she forms these connections with and these bonds with. The found family theme in this book is wonderful, and the small acts of resistance and the way people protect each other was just like, yeah, intensely moving, and I just loved this so much. I just thought this book was fantastic, and I think, like The Mayor by Angharad Hampshire last year, I think this is a really important novel, and one I hope a lot of people will read, because I do think it asks a lot of important questions and makes you think about a lot of important things. And it's also extremely powerful and looks at, you know, a terrible time in history that we should all make sure we know about, and also looks at autism and research into autism, and sort of the history of that in a really interesting way. I just thought it was amazing, and I would highly, highly recommend it. So far, as I said, I've read 4 books from the long list, 3 of which were on the shortlist, and The Matchbox Girl is definitely my favourite so far by a very long way. I very, very much hope this wins. Obviously I do have some more books to read from the shortlist and long list, but I very much hope The Matchbox Girl wins, because I thought it was incredible. Sorry if the camera angle has moved. I managed to throw my hardback book at the tripod accidentally, so there we go. Anyway, let me talk about the shortlist for the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction this year. There are 5 books on the shortlist this year. I have now read 3 of them, one of which is The Matchbox Girl by Alice Jolly, which is my favourite. From the shortlist, I've also, as I said, read Ben Becka by Graham McRae Burnett, and Sea Scraper by Benjamin Wood. Obviously, I've spoken about Ben Becka today. I also reviewed Sea Scraper previously. I'll leave that video linked down below. I didn't get a huge amount out of Sea Scraper. I think that's very much personal taste, but I also will leave down below Dan's review. This is Dan from Dan Books Life on BookTube, who is also reading along with the Walter Scott Prize long list. And if you would like more reviews of the Walter Scott Prize, I highly recommend going to watch his channel. I am very, very behind on reading the long list this year, but Dan is not, and he's made fantastic videos, fantastic fantastic reviews about The Long List, and he really did get a lot out of Sea Scraper, and I really enjoyed watching his review, even though it wasn't a book that was for me personally. I think he also got more out of Ben Becka than I did, but The Matchbox Girl has, I think, been both of our favourites so far. And then the other two books on the shortlist that I am yet to read are The Pretender by Jo Harkin, which I am really, really excited to read. This has been sort of pretty high up on my list since The Long List was announced. And then the other one is Once the Deed is Done by Rachel Seffert, which I also think sounds really interesting. I will definitely read both of those two books within the next month or so before the Walter Scott Prize winner is announced. And I'm hoping that I'll also read quite a few more books from The Long List, because I've only read 4 books from the whole long list so far, and there were a lot of other books on The Long List that really interest me. I've got out from the library Venetian Vespers, Helm, and The Two Roberts, all of which I hope to read in the next few weeks. I probably would have read them towards the end of April, but I was away on holiday, and I never like to take library books away with me on holiday because I always worry about losing them, even though I've never done that. But you know, anyway, I will hopefully read them very soon. So yeah, I'm looking forward to reading more Walter Scott Prize books over the next few weeks. Do let me know if you have read either of these two or anything else from The Long List and what you thought of them. And otherwise, thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.